Good morning and welcome. My name is Angela Davis and I'm the 4 a.m. quilter. Today this video is all about the Dresden plate. I really enjoyed making this quilt for two reasons. Number one, I haven't made one in several years. And number two, I wanted to make a really large Dresden plate. Normally in traditional Dresden plates, they're approximately, 12 inches, 18 inches square, the background fabric, and then you have your Dresden plate in the middle. And they're usually just a repeated block, 4 across, 5 down, 5 across, 6 down, that sort of thing. I wanted to make these Dresden plates large, and I wanted to use some really fun colors. And when I started out, I started cutting a few different color patterns of fabric because I wasn't sure which ones I was going to choose yet. And you'll see that later on in the video. But I did run into a couple of obstacles, and I'll tell you why. I used a Dresden plate pattern that I already had, a template. Now, when you cut templates for a pattern, you should always write down a few things on the template. You should write down, number one, is it the cut size, which includes the seam allowance, or is it the finished size, which does not include the seam allowance? Well, my original pattern that I drew this pattern from, I didn't have that marked. So I assumed it included the seam allowance, which gave me a problem. I thought I would need 16 blades in order to make one Dresden plate. Well, when I did that, nothing was matching up. It was puckering, and I had to eventually take apart the first Dresden plate by the seam and add 2 more blades, which gave me 18 blades for one Dresden plate. Now, the second thing that I made a mistake on was the original Dresden plate. I didn't write down what degrees is it. And a Dresden plate is based on a circle and the degree of the circle, which gives you the number of sections within the circle. I didn't have that written down either on the original plate, on the original pattern piece. So as a result, I had to, number one, take the original Dresden plate apart, add 2 more blades. So instead of being 16 blades, I had 18 blades, and it didn't lay flat. So what I had to do was, in the Dresden plate, I had to do some taking in of the seams, which means I took a couple of these seams and I stitched another seam allowance so that it would take in the excess so that the plate would lay flat. So I had to play with the Dresden plate a little bit. What I'm gonna do with this plate, I'm gonna throw it away. And I'm going to start from scratch, so that I can have a Dresden plate template. The number one has information like, is this the cut size or the finish size? What degrees did I use, which dictates how many number of blades are within a plate, and then I'm going to mark how many blades total do I need for that Dresden plate, and what size will this finish to be. So my Dresden plate from edge to edge finished at about 18 inches, 18 and a half inches. So I chose a 30-inch background on my white so that there would be plenty of space in between for quilting. So in general, I'm pleased with how it turned out. Had some challenges along the way, but that's because I didn't do my prep work in advance. So learn from my mistakes, okay? Number one, when you have a template, mark the name of the template. Is it finished size? Is it cut size? How many pieces do I need for the pattern? If it's based on a circle, write down the degrees so that you know what angle this is, okay? What the angle is, to help you get that accuracy within the pattern. Now, fortunately, we have a lot of resources available to us so that we don't need to use a compass to figure that out. If somebody else has already figured it out, use one of their templates. There are a lot of free downloads on the internet. There's a lot of books available that you can check out at the library. If somebody else has done the math, go ahead and do it. I used one of my templates that I had, and unfortunately when I made the template several years ago, I never bothered marking down any of the information, so that was my fault. So, here we go. You're gonna watch how I make this Dresden plate quilt top. I hope you enjoy it. Have a great day. My name's Angela Davis, and I am the 4am Quilter. I started with choosing my fabric, and I decided on measuring the height of my template, which is 7 inches. So I'm cutting 7-inch strips from the fabric, and I'm just cutting off that beginning edge to make sure that it's nice and straight. Boy, that fabric wants to slide, doesn't it? And I'm just cutting. And at this point, I'm not sure how many colors I'm going to choose for the blades on the plates. I'm just randomly choosing colors and cutting strips. At this point, I'm going to set aside my colors and I'm going to start cutting my blades. And I'm using a pre-made template that I made out of cardboard. And I layered my fabric so that I'm getting double the amount of pieces from one cut. And as you can see here, I'm just using the template as a guide for my ruler. And I'm just alternating that template back and forth so that I get as many pieces as I can from one strip of fabric. And as I said earlier, at this point I'm not sure how many colors I'm going to use or the designs I'm going to use, but I wanted to cut out a few different patterns of fabric so that I have some choices. And I'm pairing them up and I'm sewing them right sides facing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm just assembly line sewing my pieces together. I'm pressing the seams flat and I'm using a steam iron and I'm pressing them flat to set the seam And as you recall from my previous videos, setting the seam means you're pressing the seam first flat, which helps sink that seam into the fabric. And if there were any little tufts or any little tiny little loose stitches, that adheres the stitches and sinks them into the fabric. And then I open up the seam and press the seam to one direction. Now that the pairs are stitched, I've sewed the pairs together into a short row. And again, I'm pressing the seam flat, and I'm setting that seam, and then I'm opening it up, and I'm pressing it toward one direction. And on this particular plate, I'm pressing the seams toward the green. I'm going to lay the plates down, but they don't quite meet on both of these edges. And this is what I talked about earlier about my template. When I first did this, my plate didn't lay flat because there was an error in my template, because I didn't mark my template from the beginning and I didn't do my pre-measurements the way I should have. So what I had to do was I had to take that Dresden plate and I had to take out the seam and add 2 more wedges. And then, in order for it to lay flat like this, I had to actually take in some of those seams where it wasn't laying flat. I'm pressing my edges down 1/4 inch seam allowance around the entire plate, and I'm preparing it for machine applique. And I'm just turning that outer edge down 1/4 inch, and I'm steam pressing it. As you can see, I've repeated the entire process of choosing 2 more colors, creating my Dresden plate, and now I'm pressing everything nice and flat and smooth. And you can see where I've turned under 1/4 inch on the outside. And now I'm preparing my background fabric. My background fabric is 30 inches square, and I folded it into quarters, and I'm pressing it so that I get a nice vertical seam and a horizontal seam across the middle to help guide me when I lay both of my Dresden plates down for machine applique. And here I'm just pinning along the outside, preparing my Dresden plate for machine applique. And I'm making sure to keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance nice and tucked under. I've decided to do a blanket stitch for the machine applique. I'm using white for the bobbin thread, and I'm using a medium blue for the top thread, and I'm just using my blanket stitch until I've completed the machine applique on both Dresden plates. I've taken a plate from my cupboard and I'm going to create my center circle using that as my template. And I'm just drawing around the plate. I'm going to cut out the pattern piece, and I'm going to do 2 pieces for my circle, one for the back and one for the top. I'm pinning it in place, and I'm drawing around the template, and I'm not cutting the circle out at this point. I'm going to stitch it first, a 1/4 inch inside the line, not on the outside of the line, on the inside of the line of the circle. And then I'm going to trim the circle. And this is where I'm going to cut along the line that I drew. And then what I've done is I've snipped one side, turned it inside out, smoothed out the edges, and now I'm pressing it nice and flat. And here I'm just measuring to make sure that the circle is centered. I've decided for the circle that I'm going to use a regular zigzag stitch to applique it in place. And I'm just working my way all around the circle. And as you can see, my left hand is touching the circle, moving it in a circular motion, while my right hand is on the blades. And I'm just working it around, working in small sections of the circle until I come all the way back around to the beginning. And then at that point, I'm just going to stitch right over the first few stitches of where I started to lock those stitches in place. As you can see, I've just repeated that process with the blue Dresden plate. Now I'm going to press everything nice and smooth, and I'm going to sew those 2 Dresden plates together, and then I'll press that seam. I've decided to add a very narrow yellow border along the outside of the quilt, and I'm cutting my strips 1 1/4 inches so that it finishes at 3/4 of an inch. I was considering making a 1/2 inch border, but I felt as though that would be too narrow. I'm laying my strips out, and I'm going to trim the edges so that I'm cutting off that edge, that raw edge, so that they're nice and even. Now I'm going to stitch 2 lengths together for the long sides of the quilt, and then the 2 short sides, I just need 1 length on each end. I'm sewing the 2 Dresden plate blocks together, right sides facing, and I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I'm sewing 2 large pieces together like this, I tend to drop my stitch length to about a 2.5 because I'm joining 2 long sides. And I'm doing the same with the border. I chose yellow for the border because I felt that little pop of yellow would bring out the yellow from the print that I chose for the Dresden plate. At this point, my machine I felt needed a cleaning. I'd been sewing on it for quite a while, and it did need dusted out quite a bit. I've also changed out the needle, and I'm going to show you here. Look how dusty that is. So I've dusted out my machine and I've changed the needle. And this way I can keep on sewing. When I laid out the quilt top, I wasn't happy looking at that seam across the middle. I just felt as though it needed something. So I'm appliquing a strip in the middle to separate the 2 Dresden plate blocks. And I just decided on a random length, and I ironed the edges down a 1/4 inch, and then I'm just doing a straight stitch and I'm appliquing that right over that center seam. Here's the quilt all laid out, and in general I'm very pleased with the outside border that I chose. I decided on the blue batik. The border is cut at 6 inches, and I felt as though the batik was a nice added touch to complement the overall colors that I chose in this particular quilt. And I'm very happy with that little tiny yellow border. I felt as though it brought out that yellow from the blueprint.